Hello, listeners. Welcome to the U.S. Department of State Global Innovation through Science and Technology, or GIST Innovation Talk on ecosystem building. My name is Yousif. I'm a program officer at VentureWell, the main implementing partner for the GIST initiative, and I'll be your host for today. We have a great panelist with us today for the GIST Innovation Talk, Murali Prasad of SizzleScience. We're excited to have you today, Murali. For a little bit of background, Murali is the founder and CEO of SizzleScience, a commercialization consulting company in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. SizzleScience is also a GIST Innovation Hub and was the in-country partner for the GIST Investors Malaysia program. Murali, thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Samir. So I started this entire journey from an entrepreneur point myself. I graduated with a mechanical engineering degree, and I built my first startup. That led to, after 4 years of actually having the experience of becoming a founder of a tech startup, in 2012, I was exposed to the lean startup model for the first time. It gave me an idea of everything that I was missing, because when you're trained as a scientist, as an engineer, right, there's a particular way of thinking. A lot of founders from the sciences and technology side would have a similar way of thinking, right? So the lean startup model allowed me to see things or the mistakes that I've been making for the last for a long period of 4 years. My second venture, which is actually a consulting company, was to actually help entrepreneurs and scientists and founders and researchers in the country to commercialize their research, because a lot of them were having a similar problem. So that was SizzleScience back in 2012, 2013. We work very closely with universities and research labs and extend our help to institutions that would actually have commercialization issues.
And you have a very interesting background in that you've had experience on the startup side, the entrepreneurial support side, and on the investor side. As you've kind of touched all the different aspects of a thriving startup ecosystem, and you've seen all the different stakeholders, from your perspective, what are the most important aspects of a thriving startup ecosystem, and how do they interplay with each other?
Yeah, so I would say it has been an exciting journey because in an emerging economy, for instance, like Malaysia, the entire startup ecosystem or the blocks are not complete. It's fairly a new ecosystem. I would say there are 4 important elements that would be essential for any startup ecosystem. So the first element of building a startup ecosystem is having the research and science side of it intact. So we are looking at the R&D outcomes that come out from university and science labs, because these would be the core of building a startup ecosystem. That has been pretty much explored in a lot of the economies, countries, enable discoveries to happen. The second most important thing that emerging economies would need is the entrepreneurs or the rare kind of people who take up these technologies and build companies out of it. Usually, countries would pay attention to the first 2 elements. They would invest in the R&D so that you would have some level of research output coming out. And then they would invest in building the entrepreneurs who would actually be able to take up these products out to the market. The third element, which is usually left unnoticed to a later point, and that has always been a challenge, is the funding element. Emerging economies, for example, Malaysia, a lot of this funding actually happens from the government end. Now, unless and until you transcend funding from the government and start bringing in corporate fundings and private fundings together, individual fundings, until then, you have an imbalance in the funding ecosystem. Whereas there are economies in the more developed countries. In the US, I guess the transition happened pretty well. The initial funding would come from the government, but you actually had corporates and individuals and make those investments, right? But I'm sure it has been it's a long circle. It's the experience over many years building this ecosystem in Silicon Valley, for instance. The fourth element, and also an important element, is the entire population. It's the buying power of a particular economy. We can never compare the startup ecosystem in different countries, apple to apple, because the size of the population, the appetite of the population is totally different. The buying power also means the exits that might happen through corporates and of that sort. I wouldn't put them in a hierarchy manner. on the most important to the least important. I think all of them have equal importance to play, right? So it needs to be built simultaneously. The problem that we have in a lot of economies is when you do not pay attention and build this in parallel, right? So you have, for instance, in a country where there's so much of emphasis given to building entrepreneurship, but very little emphasis to build angel investor circles, right? So that needs to be in some sort of a balance in order for you to have a sustainable startup ecosystem.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There are four legs to the chair, right? And you have to make sure it's all balanced, otherwise you follow. Yeah. From that perspective, you can really start to diagnose different entrepreneurial ecosystems and see, you know, if some of them aren't thriving or there's some evident challenges. You start to understand why they're there and hopefully try to make a more targeted intervention. And so speaking to that point, you know, you've had the unique experience that I think no other actually GIST partner has, in that you've essentially engaged with us across almost all the GIST initiatives. And, you know, as you know, the GIST program at large is really focused on those four elements that you mentioned and trying to see how we can engage and support and build them out to be more cooperative. As you think about the GIST initiative as a whole, you know, what are some of the most important elements and takeaways you think that the GIST initiative is providing to the countries and the partners that we're working with?
I would imagine, and I've always challenged the concept of building startup ecosystems in silos. We would never be able to build great economies or startup economies within a particular country by itself, unless those countries are huge countries. Example, China could be its own startup ecosystem, you know, and it could survive by itself. The US could be one by itself. But leaving these two large countries aside, most of the other economies and small countries would never be able to build a formidable startup ecosystem by itself. There would need to be a potential of working together. And this is what GIST has enabled. I think GIST would be, to my best knowledge, the only governmental organization that is able to connect entrepreneurs across the globe. Most of the agencies or governmental agencies that I am aware of, and those in Malaysia, and I'm sure this is pretty much a similar case everywhere else, are mandated to build their startup ecosystem from the inside. Therein lies the challenge. It was an exciting experience when I was in the US last year, when I was able to see a room full of entrepreneurs from different emerging economies, how each one of them were able to build something amazing. I guess the founders of GIST, or people who built the GIST model, understood this. That the next big idea might not be happening in the US. There are chances that it might be happening somewhere else in the world. It should not stop us from connecting with those ideas.
That is a great point. And I know that's something very intentional that, you know, the folks at the US State Department really thought about, and how can we increase collaboration and connectiveness and make just that connective tissue that helps to catalyze a lot of the innovation and entrepreneurship. And I have to say, at the GIST Investors Forum last year, where it was you and, you know, Tariq from Egypt and, you know, Aaron from Vietnam, it was incredible seeing all of y'all in the room and just discussing much of the strategies and initiatives you've taken that are so close and aligned. And just there's so much opportunity for collaboration that, you know, may have not been clear when somebody said, you know, somebody who launched an angel network in Malaysia can collaborate with an angel network in Egypt, for instance. And so that was an awesome experience. I just love just being in the room and listening to the conversations. Yeah. And so pivoting a little bit toward angel networks and building angel investor ecosystems, can you talk a little bit more about your process and what you went through as you built angel networks in Malaysia, and, you know, what were some of the challenges but also opportunities that you saw?
It's a challenge, especially in a very young ecosystem. It's almost similar to building a startup by itself. It's never a plug and play. The biggest challenge would be to convince the people in the ecosystem to believe in angel investments. And we are still learning. So that's where we are right now.
I applaud you. You're at, what, 5 angel networks now?
So I try to shy away from those answering those questions. The reason is because it is not the number of angel networks that we can create, but it is the quality and the impact that you actually make. Right? It's almost similar to building a startup. Right? It's anyone can start a company, but how impactful and how successful that company is a question. So we have Angels in Science, which is an angel investment circle that would invest in science and technology startups. I would say that it is the only angel network in the country that specifically focuses in science and tech. And then we have University Malaya Angels, which is actually the country's first university alumni angel circle. And we plan to build more of these angel circles. It is important for each of these universities to have their own ecosystem of alumni who would be able to give back by supporting startups that come out from it. In the last 6 months, I did not expect much of angel investment activities to happen. But what actually happened was we collectively started writing our first check into a non-profit initiative. And I think that's an amazing indication of what this potential is all about. Because when we have people or members in the club who are able to make investments with absolute no return to them, it means that they are the right kind of crowd that you have to make investments in startups that would actually be able to make money.
That's a really interesting point. And I think the element of high net worth individuals putting money behind causes they believe in is a phenomenon they're way more comfortable and used to versus investing in a company and expecting a return.
Especially for early stage, I think it's an important indication because chances of startups failing is just so high in the early stage. When I kicked off the angel investment cycle in Malaysia, we were scouting and looking out for the high net worth individuals who would ideally make into the club. But it doesn't necessarily be the case because high net worth individuals may not be people who are able to make those kinds of risks. They may not be able to take those risks, right? So, and this is one thing that I realized. So an indication that people who are able to give back to the society, right? I would define them as high net worth to me, regardless of the size of check they will write. And these are the people who will actually be able to make the difference for the entrepreneurs in the longer run.
That's why you call them angels instead of investors now.
That's why I call them angels. That's why we call them angels. Yes.
So pivoting a little bit toward your role as a supporter of startups and helping to provide training and mentorship. What advice would you give to other entrepreneurial support organizations that are just getting started and are aiming to really start to engage in their ecosystem and help connect to and support startups?
It is not a plug and play world. Right? We have to understand the missing elements within each ecosystem, and it's almost building a startup by yourself, right? So we need to understand what's happening in a specific ecosystem, connecting to the right group of people, and especially in ecosystems where the entire structure of the startup world is not completely built. You're not just connecting the dots. In some cases, we will actually be creating those dots or helping create those dots. I would suggest the right thing to do is actually to have focus in certain market spaces or industries and then build your circle from there. For a small country like Malaysia, we can't build a startup ecosystem from a geographical point of view, right? I can't build an angel circle that would just focus in Kuala Lumpur, as how angel circles in the US would focus just in Silicon Valley or Boston or New York, right? That model will not work in Malaysia for a small country like Malaysia because the number of startups that you would be getting in a particular location or a particular state is just too small. Now, if I were to just take those models from the US and build the same, I'm actually limiting the chance of me investing in good startups. So we are seeing beyond Malaysia, we are looking into Southeast Asia as a whole, a larger entity, a larger space. And I think when you increase that size of space, but you focus on the industries, for instance, healthcare, you have a better chance of finding successful startups or potentially successful startups to invest in. The people who are building these spaces, the people who give this kind of support, should be looking into the bigger picture and what fits your particular space, what fits your particular market. The Japanese startup system is completely different from the Korean startup system or the Indian startup system. We have to work with the existing players and how we can actually complement.
It makes a lot of sense. And you dropped a lot of knowledge on us right now. and you kind of just talked about the different elements of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and how they interplay and the importance of making everything kind of be culturally competent. Before we sign off, do you have any final words just to share with the audience and those that are listening?
The business of entrepreneurship is an important part of the world as we see it today. I think COVID has dropped so much of light, as much as the damage that it has causing the world. It is also teaching us that we are able to build things faster than anything that we thought we can possibly do. We are able to work together in remote spaces. I would say COVID is actually the actual disruptor, right? So it's actually disrupting the world. I think that innovation often happens when there is chaos. One example that I would give in Malaysia is when the lockdown happened and the corporates were closed and the large corporates were closed. It was the entrepreneurs who were actually built to operate in a startup mode who were able to go out and make the impact, right? So they were making impact in an individual capacity. They were making impact from the startups they run in. But because we have been accustomed to manage chaos, to manage uncertainties, COVID almost felt like that's how things are on a usual day for us.
I know your iHub was very active in responding to the pandemic and specifically around mobilizing to get more hand sanitizers out to different parts of Malaysia. So if you could just share a little bit more about that initiative, how it got started and where you are at now.
So I would imagine that as one of the most purposeful things that I've engaged myself in. We mobilized 6 university labs across Malaysia, which were able to produce hand sanitizers for a fraction of the cost of those selling the market, and give it out free to the needy who were not able to purchase hand sanitizers at the price they were selling, right? So it was ridiculously high. I think that's the case everywhere. And through these 6 universities, we were able to produce, and in a very lean way, able to produce close to about 40,000 hand sanitizer bottles. And because of the lockdown, we were not able to travel between states. So we had mobilized these universities in different states, and each state had its own supply chain network in place. How did this happen? I would have to thank GIST for it. Why? Because the 6 universities is actually part of a GIST network in the country, right? And Malaysia is an interesting country. We have the Peninsular Malaysia, and then we have the Borneo, where we have 2 other states, and we are divided by the sea. In a time when there were no shipments allowed, logistics were down between the two parts of the country, we were actually able to have our own initiative run in one of those states in Borneo and support Borneo by itself.
Well, I have to applaud you for that. That was, an incredible initiative, and it was just great seeing you mobilize all the different aspects within Malaysia to really get this done. And the volume of hand sanitizers you were able to produce in a very decentralized way is very impressive. So just really applaud the effort you took and your commitment to it. And we're glad that the GIST initiative could support in any way. And just to summarize some of the key points that I pulled out of your many comments. So first, when you're thinking about what are the important elements of creating a thriving startup ecosystem, the first is having a strong research and development space, right? And having a lot of science, innovation, and technology, and investing in that early stage development. And then obviously the second most important thing is having the entrepreneurs that are able to commercialize that technology, right? And willing to take those risks. Funding is the third most important pillar. And that's not only, public sector funding, which can help catalyze and start it, but, it requires a lot of private sector, individuals, venture capital funds, corporate venture arms, and then finally just the size and the buying power of the population within the country or within the region, and that it also includes those like large corporates that are potentially the exits for some of these startups. And the next piece around, what the value of the GIST initiative, really, it's being that connective tissue across countries to help support and connect the entrepreneurs, the investors, the entrepreneurial support organizations to each other and see how they can leverage and support and scale alongside each other. And then in regards to, angel networks, you can learn from the US ecosystem, but you can't replicate it. And you have to really come in with a firm understanding of where the ecosystem is, where are the potential angel investors as far as their investment thesis and their investment acumen and their comfort putting money behind early stage companies. And then as you talked about, your advice to other entrepreneurial support organizations is identifying a niche, whether it be geographic or sectoral, really serving that market and then starting to scale from there, because it's not a plug and play model, right? You have to tailor the resources, the support, the mentorship, and the programs to the cultural context and the needs of the startups you're working with, especially when it comes to newer startup ecosystems. And then actually want to close out with your final saying is just innovation happens in chaos. We're finding new ways to engage, to innovate, and to build, and it's been really exciting to see that. So thank you, Murali. Thank you for joining us, sharing your insights and your perspectives. I really enjoyed this conversation. To all those listening, we encourage y'all to check out the other GIST Innovation Talks and also visit www.gistnetwork.org to get additional information on our work. Thank you.